This week, Saul has gone over to the dark side. A couple of weeks ago, he was the humble king who was hiding among the baggage. Now he's trying to take his rivals off take them out, kill them, and he perceives David as a great threat to his kingship. Never mind the fact that David has no designs whatsoever on the throne. David has been anointed at this point, actually, even before David killed Goliath. Samuel went to David's house, anointed him as the future king of Israel. David knows he's going to be king. Therefore, he is actually just trusting God for accomplishing that one day. And so he, at this point, is anointed. But you know who else is anointed? Saul. Samuel has anointed them both king of Israel. So now David's anointing is less public than Saul's was. About two people maybe know about David's anointing. Well, David's family probably knows as well. But Saul is the anointed king, and as such, David serves him. And that's kind of the background where our story starts today. Is since King David killed Goliath in last week's story, I keep calling him King David. You know, we're used to calling him King David. He's not King David yet. He's David, the shepherd boy, who becomes David, the intrepid soldier. So last week he killed Goliath, but that was just the start of his journey toward military triumphs. He ends up being quite the asset to the army of Israel. He becomes a leader of men. He embarks on a series of military campaigns that are exceedingly fruitful. He is undefeated in the field. This Goliath conquest it just goes on from there to a number of successes and triumphs for the future king. Now, if you are the king, how does this make you feel? You know, there's two ways that this can make you feel. Either you can say, "Wow, I am really blessed by God that I have this man on my side," or you can say, "This man is a threat to me and needs to be dealt with harshly." Saul chooses option B. He sees David as a threat. Again, despite the fact David literally is not a threat. David has no designs on forcibly taking the kingdom from Saul. And yet, Saul, in his paranoia, refuses to see this and rises up in murderous anger against David. The excuse me, chapter previous to this, Saul had flung a spear at David. He missed. That's kind of how things are going for Saul these days. Throw a spear at a guy, you miss. Now, if David throws a spear at somebody, you better believe where that spear is going to end up. But yeah, Saul missed. And then Saul was a little remorseful. Now, actually, maybe he hasn't gone full on dark side. I mean, he is trying to kill people, so there is that. But also, he does have these moments, and he will continue for a while to have these moments of remorse where he's like, "Oh, gee, I shouldn't do this." Now, unfortunately, unlike Anakin, King Saul does not get any kind of a redemption narrative at the end, but he continues to just spiral downward. Ends up hitting rock bottom when he's talking to mediums trying to find the spirit of Samuel, but that's all off in the future. For now, he is he's intent on just removing David from the chessboard, if you will. Now, there is an element of complication here. Jonathan, the king's son and the king's heir. Should Saul perish, Jonathan is the next man in line for the throne. And Saul has every intention to keep his family line going. Not so much because he loves his son. We see in today's story at one point Saul throws a spear at Jonathan, just to show how indiscriminate he is about throwing spears around. What do you think happens when Saul throws a spear at Jonathan? He misses. I do think God was involved somewhat in Saul's poor aim and poor marksmanship at times, but in any event, Jonathan is the heir that Saul would prefer to get the throne so that his name and his legacy can continue to resound in Israel. The interesting thing about Jonathan, he has no designs on the throne, even though it's technically his throne for the taking. Saul looks around. I mean, try this, third time's a charm. Jonathan looks around. He sees the lay of the land. He sees that God's hand is on David. I don't think he knows David was anointed. Maybe he does, because Jonathan is convinced, no, this is the man for the job. I shouldn't be king. This guy should be king. He's got everything it takes. He's a man after God's own heart, a wildly successful military leader. He should be king, not me. So Jonathan, also just a very close friendship with David. These two guys are closer than brothers. They love each other dearly. They are willing to serve one another. And again, just a stunning development in Jonathan's case as a man who was raised by Saul, told he will be the king, but then is able in humility to look at David and say, no, this guy should be the king instead. And so we have this narrative in our story this week, which David understands before Jonathan Saul's murderous intent. David tries to tell his friend Jonathan, hey, your dad wants to kill me. Jonathan says, no, I mean, I know he can get a little overbearing at times, but he's got a good heart. He wouldn't kill you. I mean, not only do you not have designs on the throne, but my father would be stupid to kill his best military leader. David's like, no, trust me, he wants to kill me. Well, we'll see how it is. I'm gonna skip out on this dinner where David's thinking, like, if he goes to this dinner, that'll be the last dinner he ever goes to. So he says, I'm gonna skip out on this dinner, and you kind of keep an eye on your dad. If he's chill about me not being there, then okay, then you're right. I was wrong, and he doesn't want to kill me. But if you see that he gets a little bit irate that I'm not there, that should kind of tip you off, Jonathan, that I'm right about this and he wants to kill me. So they put that to the test, and in what transpires? Well, that's when Saul throws the spear at Jonathan. So, okay, I think we know what Saul's intent really is, and so Jonathan, he works out this elaborate scheme, kind of strange, this elaborate scheme he works out in order to communicate to David, where he brings this guy into the field and he shoots some arrows and shoots an arrow wide on purpose so he can yell out, you gotta run, you gotta take off. It is kind of strange, and then David and Jonathan are able to have this conversation. It's like, if they are able to have the conversation, why shoot the arrows? I read some commentaries on that. It always kind of bothered me about this story, like, why the rigmarole with the arrows? You don't necessarily have to get into this with your Sunday school class, but if you're just curious about what's going on there, best guess commentary I saw was that Jonathan didn't know if Saul would be accompanying him when he's out in the field. In this way, he'd be able to communicate with David even if they weren't able to communicate face to face. But the other possibility is that David's gone. Saul might be suspicious here if Jonathan disappears too. So Jonathan brings along he's got a servant with him who can vouch for him that, oh yeah, Jonathan was just out there shooting arrows. Nothing funny going on, Dad, really. Whatever the case may be, they are able to have this parting moment where Jonathan is able to give a heads up to David that, yep, you better run. You better get out of town. My dad really does want to kill you. You were right about this. And they go their separate ways. And Jonathan ends up saying, go in peace, because we have sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring forever. In effect, what Jonathan is saying there is, buddy, I don't know if I'm ever going to see you again, but we'll always be brothers. And your family and my family, remember that we love each other, and we're going to show kindness to one another. Yeah, my dad wants to kill you, but let's set that aside a second. And in fact, as it turns out, in the years after, Jonathan's son did get a place of honor in King David's court, just to show some closure to that story. So, what does this story tell us? It is kind of a weird one just to have an isolated story in the Sunday school class because it's hard to place within the big contextual narrative of God's work in Israel. Um, it's usually, though, put in Sunday school lessons for one reason because the friendship of David and Jonathan affords us opportunities to teach kids about what friends should be. Um, you actually don't get a whole lot of that in the Bible as far as that kind of after school special kind of thing. Here's what a good friend is. And this David Jonathan story really illustrates that really well. Larger contextual narrative here is that this is setting up David's time in exile. And I don't think we actually spend a whole lot of time, I haven't looked too far ahead at the lessons. I don't think we spend a whole lot of time with David in exile. Um, but it's an important part of King David's narrative because the concept of the king being in exile, he's the king, he is anointed, and yet he's not able to, or he's not at this, the timing is not right for him to assume his throne publicly. So he goes incognito. Well, in David's case, well, he did kind of go incognito at times. Like when that one time when he acted insane and started drooling all over his beard. I don't think that's a Sunday school lesson. Keep reading in First Samuel and you'll get it. But the point is, the king in exile is an important biblical theme. Tolkien realized as much. That was one of the whole points of the Lord of the Rings story to show Aragorn being in exile, and that's just all about that's. Tolkien was a Christian too, right? So that's all about Jesus too. So this David being in exile, and it becomes an important point to understand Jesus's ministry, as he is the King of all, even as he is on the outside looking in, even as people sit on the throne. And Jesus' day, there will be a King Herod who will order all of the babies of Babylon killed, babies of Bethlehem. Might have been a little bit too much of a project for him to kill all the babies of Babylon, but yeah, the fact you have an evil king who is afraid of a usurper. I mean, that was King Saul, that was King Herod. So there's a real parallel there. In both cases, this was a paranoia that was not logical or not in tune with reality. And Jesus had no designs on King Herod's throne. He had a much bigger throne in mind. And King David also had no designs on King Saul's throne until the proper time, until the time was right. Saul could have just lived a natural life, sat on the throne a long time. He would have died. Jonathan would have been the next man up on the throne, and Jonathan would have said, I abdicate. I'm giving the throne over to David. Things would have been so nice. Things would have been so peaceful. Then again, things would have been peaceful too in Galilee if the Romans and the Jewish leadership and King Herods of the world had simply understood who Jesus was, and that he was, although in some ways Jesus very much a threat, but not the kind of threat that they thought he was. So that's the larger point of what's going on here is you got a jealous king and a future king in exile, which parallels and sets up what David's son will one day endure. The other kind of thing narratively that's going on here, messianic a reflection of messianic work, is I see Jonathan as a John the Baptist kind of figure. Maybe I'm a little bit led that way by their names, but Jonathan is one who is willing to take a lesser role because he recognizes somebody greater than him is here. And this is something that John the Baptist was also very willing to do. At one point, a couple of John's followers drift off and start following Jesus. And then some of John's other followers say, hey, why don't you fight for your disciples here? Don't let them follow that newcomer. You were here first. And John the Baptist famously says, I must decrease so that he may increase. That's something, one of the very first classes I ever took to learn pastoral ministry. That's something that I still remember the instructor talking about for all of us who become pastors. Be reminded, hey, this is not about you. This ministry is not yours. You must decrease so that Jesus may increase. I I try to live by that, and I pray that in all of our lives, there's what was that song, Christian song that came out a while ago? I'll see if I can find it and send you a link. It's a really moving song about somebody talking about how they want to be remembered, and basically it's like, you know what? I don't want to be remembered. I just want you to remember Jesus. Which is really an interesting and I mean and absolutely right on when we think about like our families. What do we want them to remember about us? You know, if they remember all the good things we did, but don't remember that we had a relationship with the Lord, that's a fail. So Jonathan's situation here is in humility. He's willing to take a background role, and this is all of our calling, to take a background role and let Jesus shine. And so that's the other kind of big picture kind of thing going on in this story. So, and again, we have that theme we've been talking about a couple of weeks now, where we have the humble being exalted and the exalted being humbled. Jonathan, in his way, will become exalted, although his his exaltation really doesn't come in this life. David will become exalted after this period of intense testing and trial, as now he's going to be on the run from King Saul for actually a number of years. He's going to be on the run from King Saul. And then King Saul, being the one who has now exalted himself, there will come a day of reckoning for him. There will come a day when he is humbled, which is the last thing he wants to do right now. He doesn't want any humility. I mean, even turning on his own son when his son simply speaks positive for David. All right, so I think we found Christ pretty well in the story. What does the story tell us about who we are, our identity as God's people? Uh, Boy, this theme keeps coming up in Scripture. The world may tell you one thing, but you know differently. You know, Jonathan was being told, "You are the king. You will be the king." Jonathan says, "No, I have a different way of looking at things." The world, the world will tell you one thing, but ultimately, what you need to hang your hat on is what God says about you. And David is anointed. He realizes his identity is anointed by God, and this allows him to be able to handle whatever kind of adversity comes his way from Saul or anyone else. He knows he's been anointed. In the same way, any who have been baptized into Christ have been anointed. You have been set aside and declared righteous, declared a child of God. So don't let the world tell you anything else about who you are. Trust in your baptismal identity for whatever adversity comes your way. Hold tight to knowing that you belong to Jesus. You're a child of God. What does the story tell us about God and His mercies? Um, yeah, He will continue to exalt the humbled. David is going to be blessed, even though it may not look that way, as he's forced. No good deed goes unpunished. David did nothing but serve Saul, and now he's forced to live in exile. And yet, God will lift him out of that exile. God will lift all of us out of our exile as well. And how does the story tell us how to live as God's people? Well, both David and Jonathan set fine examples for us of humility and being willing to suffer and knowing that God will provide the ultimate justice. Sometimes we think we have to take matters into our own hands, but we many psalms about this. David didn't like what was happening to him, but he wrote a number of psalms saying, "Okay, I'm just going to trust you, God. You are a just God. You will work out justice in due time." Um, yeah, there's some neat applications here as far as the eighth commandment as well. You know, not to bear false testimony, but to speak kindly of others and to explain things in the kindest way. Jonathan really illustrates the eighth commandment very well as he speaks well of David, he speaks highly of David, he tries to defend David to his father. You know, anytime we have an opportunity to advocate for someone who can't advocate for themselves. Jonathan had his father's ear. Now it didn't work out. His father didn't listen to Jonathan, but that doesn't change our calling when we have a chance to put in a good word for somebody, to testify to speak well about somebody. If we have somebody's ear, let's do that instead of tearing people down. Let's say the nicest things we can and the kindest things we can about others. All right, God's blessings on your preparations this week.